Okay. Well, it's great to be back in Lismore this morning. Today, I'm joined by the Deputy Premier, Paul Toole, by local members, as well as Professor Mary O'Kane and former Police Commissioner Mick Fuller, who have conducted a review into the floods here in New South Wales. And we're also joined by David Witherden, who's the head of the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Authority. Well, it's been an incredibly challenging time, particularly for our Northern Rivers communities. Yes, there's been flooding across the state, but nowhere has it been worse or as devastating, traumatic and distressing for our communities in the Northern Rivers. What I can say is that this event, this catastrophic event, occurred 6 months ago. And so much progress has been made in such a short period of time. The devastating scenes and the trauma for many people who were affected immediately by that event. The apocalyptic scenes following the flooding that led to a significant clean-up operation. Today, we stand in Lismore with many businesses now either have reopened or on the path to reopening. People have returned to homes, but there is a very, very long journey ahead. There are many people right across our state, over 1,000 people, who are still living out of their home or who are homeless as a result of these events. There is a substantial journey that lies ahead for the people of our state, but I want to make this point. The spirit of the Northern Rivers community has been significant. The heroism, the sacrifice that we saw during those events, I think should make all of us proud to be Australians. People putting other people before themselves. And as Premier, I'm very proud of that spirit of service that we've seen in our community, and particularly here in the Northern Rivers. The power of nature to swamp the beautiful Northern Rivers was devastating. And that will be matched by our commitment and our dedication to rebuild and recreate our communities for the future. That will not happen overnight. But I particularly want to thank Mary O'Kane and Mick Fuller for the work that they've put in relation to this flood report. Today, the government releases that report and also responds. We've accepted every recommendation. Some will take longer to implement than others, but the focus of the government will be to implement these recommendations as quickly as possible. The recommendations are generally in two parts, so I'll give a brief update in relation to those recommendations and the government's implementation. The two major sections of the review refer to how we evolve emergency management in our state firstly, and I'll address that. And then secondly, how we prepare and recover from events of this scale, both in the short term and in the long term, and what the implications are for our state. So in relation to the future of emergency management, there are a number of recommendations that the government will support, but in brief they are as follows. We'll be establishing a permanent state emergency operations centre. That will be a permanent centre, and it will be led by a new Deputy Police Commissioner here in New South Wales. We'll be reshaping Resilience New South Wales and transforming it into a leaner, nimble agency known as Recovery New South Wales that will focus on the first 100 days post-event. That type of work will obviously include coordination of cleanup and the like. 3, we'll be establishing a new cabinet committee, which will be known as Task Force Hawk. That will be a committee that has senior cabinet ministers as well as senior public servants. That will be a permanent committee that is ready to respond at any moment, at any time there is a major natural disaster. We'll also be merging the back office of the RFS and the SES to focus on enhancing less focus on administration, more focus on frontline response, and obviously that transition will take some time. I do want to reiterate, there will be no change to front office, community-facing RFS and SCS. I'll have something more to say about that soon. The final key part in terms of emergency response is in relation to community training. It's very clear the time that we've spent up in the Northern Rivers, the importance of the community, and I spoke about the spirit of service of the community, but the lack of coordination from government in relation to that. But also, in addition, I'd say training. There are many people who don't have the time to carry out or to commit to being a volunteer, a uniformed volunteer. But there are many people who want to have that training, and we'll be working through programs that support members of the community receiving training from the RFS, from the SES, in the ordinary course of their lives. That will ensure that in those circumstances where these major events occur, people have the confidence of the training that they have received during this period. And in addition to that, we will be ensuring that local communities are well set up and supported by a knowledge and understanding of evacuation centres, of being the first responders in those circumstances when a major event hits. It's very clear to me during the time following the flooding in communities right across the Northern Rivers that many communities felt that there was no knowledge and understanding of how do we respond quickly, who sets up the evacuation centre, who's running the recovery centres. So that will all be implemented as well. The second aspect of the report refers to the planning and the future as we move forward. So as part of that, we'll be establishing a permanent reconstruction body. It'll be a legislative body with legislative powers, very much based on the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. There's disaster adaptation plans which will be in place, and this is about making sure we have local and regional solutions. It is raised in areas of a buyback and land swap. That is something the government is committed to. We are committed to ensuring that as we have future development, that it does not occur in areas which are subject to significant flooding. And in addition to that, those people who have lost their homes, who are in dire circumstances, we will work as a result of this report to implement a land swap and buyback scheme that will be targeted in specific areas. I know for many people that will provide uncertainty today in terms of eligibility, but that is something that we need to work through. But I can say as Premier that that is something that we are going to do. And through the Reconstruction Authority, led by David Witherden, that by the end of August, we will open expressions of interest for landholders and also looking at public land which can be made available for land swaps or that buyback scheme. So that work commences today. And I want to make this very clear as well. We are going to rebuild these communities. I said from the outset when I was here that we would be with our people every step of the way, not just in the short term, not just after the flood event when the cameras left towns, but for the long term. And this is a long journey that is in front of us, and we need to make sure we rebuild in a resilient way, in a way that keeps the character and the charm of these wonderful communities in the Northern Rivers. The way that we approach this will take time, but it'll ensure that our strong communities, whether it's Lismore or anywhere else in the Northern Rivers, have a strong and bright future. There are many people who have lived here for generations and want their children and their children to be part of this community going forward, and we will deliver that. We will just ensure that we build back in a stronger and more resilient way. Now, that said, whilst nature is devastated our beautiful communities in the Northern Rivers, that will be matched by our resolve and determination to rebuild and recreate the wonderful communities of the Northern Rivers. I want to thank Professor O'Kane and Mick Fuller for the work that they have done. Not only have they delivered when I approached them in respect of doing this review, not only have they delivered the report to government 2 months ahead of what I asked them to do, it has exceeded the expectations of the detail that I believed I'd be provided with. They've exceeded expectations. I spoke to both Mary and Mick at the start and said I don't want a political report. I want a report that goes to the heart to ensure that as we rebuild well and we address the issues that are there in front of us. I don't care about political sensitivities. I care about our people and looking after them, getting them back into homes and rebuilding our communities in the Northern Rivers. That is what's most important. For some in this report, it'll be hard reading. I accept that. But we cannot keep doing things the same way that we've done in the past. We need to do things differently. And that's exactly what the New South Wales government will do off the back of this report. I want to thank our volunteers. There's been a lot of commentary, which I think is completely unfair in relation to our frontline volunteers. We are incredibly blessed as a state and as a country to have so many people who risk their lives each and every day to look after every one of us. And whether that's our SES, our RFS, or all our volunteer organisations, you are truly heroes. And this report today being handed down, that we thank you. We thank you for everything that we do. And I do want to ask as well, if you haven't thought about joining a volunteer organisation like the SES or the RFS, please do so. These are great opportunities for people to look after others, and it's a great aspect of the Australian culture and the Australian way of life that is unique to anywhere else in the world. So to all our volunteers who are always there when we're going through tough times, on behalf of the government, of the members of the parliament, from right across party political lines, can we thank you for everything that you do. Finally, before I pass to the Deputy Premier for some comments, can I thank the community and all those who have been affected, particularly here in the Northern Rivers. I know it has been an incredibly traumatic and difficult time. I have had the opportunity to meet with so many people during the course of the last 6 months. The progress that has been made, the resilience and the steely determination of our people is something to behold. And my commitment to you as Premier is that I will be here every step of the way as we move through. I said when we came up following that catastrophic event that I would keep coming back, and my commitment is I will keep coming back again until we implement all of these recommendations, until every single person in the Northern Rivers is back in a home. This will take time, but as far as I'm concerned as Premier, this is the top priority for our government. We should always be judged on how we look after our most vulnerable people, and the trauma and the distress and the challenges that have faced our people in the Northern Rivers in the past and continue as we move through this next phase. Rest assured that the New South Wales government will be with you every step of the way. Now I'm going to pass to the Deputy Premier. Then Mick Fuller will provide some advice in relation to the changes that he has recommended, that we are adopting in relation to emergency management. Professor Mary O'Kane will speak to the issues in respect of climate and planning that she has recommended going forward, which once again we are adopting and will implement. Then I will have the local member for Lismore, Janelle Saffin, speak on behalf of local members of the Northern Rivers, and then we'll take any of your questions. Paul.
Well, thanks, Premier. There's no doubt that the flood inquiry report ensures that all communities across New South Wales are better supported in times of emergencies. And we've only got to have a look at the Northern Rivers, and we saw those floods. And we know that emergency services, we know that the community, they tried their best. But we need to rethink the way in which we respond to natural disasters. And that's why this report is making a number of recommendations that can better support communities and better support our response. Now, the flood inquiry is looking at preparation, it's looking at response, and it's looking at recovery. And it's a model that can be used not only for natural disasters like bushfires and floods, but it also can be used for biosecurity threats like foot and mouth disease that could actually potentially get into this country and into this state. I also want to make the point that I welcome the news of a 5th Deputy Commissioner of Police. And I think this is a vote of confidence in the incredible work that our police do on the ground. Our men and women in blue have been given a vote of confidence by the public for the work that they are seen to be doing. Our men and women in blue, they are trusted, they are respected. And you look at what police do, they have a chain of command. And I certainly look forward to seeing those structures being put forward together in a timely manner. Could I also say police have displayed incredible bravery in this area. We had incredible stories of where police officers went into homes, where they even rescued a 93-year-old lady that was actually at the ceiling of her building, and they actually took her out on a boogie board. We've also had people like Mal Lanyon, who's led the flood recovery here in this area. So police will certainly have a key and a critical role in dealing with natural disasters and continuing with emergency situations across the state. Can I thank Professor Mary O'Kane, and can I thank Mick Fuller as well for the report. This report has been done 2 months earlier than what was originally anticipated. So it also allows the government the ability to be able to respond to the recommendations and get on with some of the planning that is required to support communities, not just here in the Northern Rivers, but also those communities right across the state that are going to face emergency situations from time to time. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I want to thank the Premier and the Deputy Premier on behalf of Professor Mary O'Kane and myself for the opportunity to co-lead the flood inquiry to the weather events of 2022. Can I give you an assurance that Mary and I travelled high and low in terms of the inquiry? We held multiple town halls with hundreds of people, particularly those who were affected by the floods. We had virtual town halls with key stakeholders like the mayors across New South Wales, and of course we had one-on-one interviews with key stakeholders like the commissioners across the emergency services, and all that led us to what we believe are 28 key recommendations. And these aren't recommendations in the weed about low-level issues. Professor O'Kane and I were keen to keep the recommendations down, but look for structural change, look for change in organisation that will drive cultural change, that will make sure that the community of New South Wales is put first. Yes, can I acknowledge the volunteers across New South Wales, of which, if we didn't have them, emergency services wouldn't exist. Can I acknowledge particularly the challenges that the SES volunteers faced in the midst of these weather events, and I think that they were themselves let down on many occasions, and that is evidence that we have heard. So from the emergency management perspective, yes, I have made some key recommendations, and that is a permanent CECON. And why? During COVID, we saw times where, as the Commissioner of Police, I was running the Police Force plus COVID. We saw times where retired Deputy Commissioner Gary Warboys was running COVID, plus Regional New South Wales. And from my perspective, it was such a key role. I think it gave enormous confidence in the community that a senior police officer had taken charge. To be clear, there are no additional powers with this role. It is just about identifying how important it is establishing a permanent CECON. They will take on many roles, including making sure that local government and regional areas are trained, exercised, have the appropriate people in place to respond to not just floods, but any emergencies. Yes, there's talk of back-of-house mergers with the SES and the RFS, and that is a key recommendation. And the reason being is the RFS over the last 20 years has grown into a full-time organisation, and they are campaigners, and we've seen what they've done through the bushfires. Their ability to plan and use intelligence is well above even some of the other permanent agencies. To grow that in the SES would take years and years and years. Why wouldn't we merge them and bring together these two agencies where they are working together to protect the people of New South Wales? In saying that, we will continually protect the SES, the brand, that forward-facing. They are so important in terms of protecting the people of New South Wales in storms, floods and tsunamis, and it really allows them to focus on the operational abilities rather than the back-of-house training and those issues that really tie them up in non-essential information. In terms of public messaging, we're seeking changes to that. What we've seen through Services New South Wales is a single point of truth through bushfires and COVID. they would, in theory, take on that role going forward. And under Emma Hogan, they have done an outstanding job over the last couple of years. But overall, these changes are all about protecting the community, putting the community first. Yes, there will be changes in relation to flood rescue, but they will marry up like road rescue, which means who is the closest person with the best skills to rescue you. And I think that has worked well for road rescue and vertical rescue across the state. And I really feel that the State Rescue Board will embrace these changes and change the way that we train, and particularly use the resources that we have for multi-agency rescue. If you look at fire and rescue in metropolitan Sydney, they sit extremely neatly to take a joint lead with the SES in relation to flood rescue. And then, of course, in regional New South Wales, rural fire would play such an important role as well. Rural fire have 70,000 volunteers, 50,000 active, and they have about 20,000 that can jump on a fire truck at any time. Unfortunately, SES is a much smaller organisation, and they have around 200 people who are trained for flood rescue. And in a state of 8 million people, when we see catastrophic weather events, it's just not enough. And it's not the fault of the SES, but trying to build the SES up like the RFS would take 20 years. We don't have time. The RFS has got a very sound commissioner. There are campaigners, and they will take and embrace the back-of-house merger without devaluing the brand of the SES. I appreciate some volunteers will be disappointed by this, but I truly believe this will start to empower the volunteers at the SES to get better training, to get better capability to protect the people of New South Wales. So they are some of the key emergency management recommendations. I will pass to Professor Mary O'Kane now to talk about the planning changes and some of the mitigations, and happy to take your questions. Professor.
Thanks, Mick. And I too would like to acknowledge and thank the Government of New South Wales, the Premier, Deputy Premier and the rest of the Cabinet for inviting Mick and me to do this inquiry. I'm a rerun since I did the bushfire inquiry, so I'm a bit into disasters. I also want to acknowledge the community, everybody who did submissions, who helped us with very bright ideas, who were willing to have tough discussions with us about the whole thing. I'd like to acknowledge the government departments that also worked very well with us, both our state colleagues, local government across the state, and federal agencies who worked with us, the Bureau, Defence and so on. I borrowed the Premier's copy. I want to tell you it's a riveting read, this book. This is only volume 2, there's volume 1 and 3. I want to make a few comments about the weather. We all, Australians, love the weather. And one of the things, we don't know enough how much of this was climate change. We do know that the storms were not particularly unusual. They're well within the historic record. We know from round here that in the 1890s, for example, there were several East Coast lows, one after the other. But what was unusual was the intensity of the rain and the fact that the rain stalled, and unfortunately stalled right over Lismore. And we saw this again in the more recent floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean. And so this is a phenomenon that is probably, could be, there's more work to be done, climate change, but certainly something that we've got to be on the lookout for. And do read about it. And one of the important things about this inquiry is we emphasise the importance of community being prepared, community knowing what to look for, that we need better warning of things like flash flooding. We also emphasise the importance of kids knowing about things, that education in schools about how you respond to disasters, because it's often kids saying, "Mum, why don't we have a disaster plan on the back of the kitchen door?" That's really important. We heard that in the fire inquiry, we heard it again in the flood inquiry. About planning, a really riveting read in this, in volume 2. There's a lot here about the planning system and about the needs for improvements to deal with disasters and particularly floods. What we're doing here, and as the Deputy Premier said, we've brought this in a couple of months early because we are bringing here the high-level principles and the system changes that need to be made that will enable the fine decisions to be made on where the buybacks happen, where the building needs to occur. And So all of that needs to be moving into place, and we particularly recommend a reconstruction authority along the lines of the one that Queensland's developed so well over the years, and that the importance of it in cutting through red tape and getting recommendations into place. And we're very, very lucky that the Reconstruction Corporation has been established already and getting going, and will work with these recommendations to sort of now make those fine level decisions. There's also recommendations on the environment, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge Oliver Costello, a Bundjalung man from this region, who wrote a wonderful piece for the inquiry, which you can read in volume 3, and which led to the important recommendations on the environment. One very important aspect of the environment is we say that the floodplain should be recognised as assets, but not assets that we live on. Assets that we use for a variety of things, whether it be renewable energy, whether it be parks, whether it be biodiversity offsets. There's lots of very important uses for the floodplains, and they should come back into public ownership, maybe leased again on 99-year leases. We also talk about evacuation and the importance of roads, and not having people caught in the one road in, one road out scenario without a way to deal with things, knowing how people must evacuate. We also talk about critical infrastructure and the importance of it as much as possible not being on the floodplain. So I commend this to you. If you can't sleep, you probably will even be able to sleep less after you read particularly the weather bit. Thank you. Yeah. Come forward.
Look the part?
Yeah.
Look the part.
So I have the privilege of speaking with my parliamentary colleagues, the member for Clarence, Chris Galaptis, and member for Ballina, Tamara Smith, and the member for Tweed, Jeffrey Provost. And I'll begin by acknowledging we're here today on the land of the Bundjalung Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise other nations across our northern rivers. I also want to recognise some of the volunteers I can see here today from our community and thank them on behalf of everybody, and also some people here who suffered in the floods and are still trying to build back and sort of reclaim their lives, so recognition to them. Also to the Southern Cross University, Ben Roach is here. They played a great role in opening their arms to our community when we were in need, and they're still doing that, so thank you. I acknowledge the Premier, the Deputy Premier being here, and David Witherton from the NRRC. And when the Premier got the report, I did approach him and say, Premier, please release a report here. We consider it our report, born of our experience, and we own it. Yes, the government will own the response, of course, and we hope the funding that comes with that, but we feel that it came from our experience, so we wanted it here. So I thank you, Premier, Deputy Premier, for doing that in our community, and also to Mary O'Kane and Mick Fuller. I backed in you doing this independently, and you did not disappoint. So thank you both. You didn't disappoint. There's 28 recommendations. The recommendations speak to our experience, they speak to our community, and also the Premier and Deputy Premier made it clear that they've accepted those recommendations. We need to see those recommendations implemented. We have a commitment as well from the Premier that they will be implemented. There'll be a special unit, and that will be within the Premier's Department of Premier and Cabinet. They'll be reportable, there'll be timelines, the community will know that's happening, we will see it. One of the things that I said, other members said, we've been through a lot of floods, we've been through a lot of bushfires, COVID disasters, we've had a lot of reports, terrific reports, we haven't always seen them implemented. And this is the one that is going to change how we adapt, become a model of adaptation, how we respond to disasters, and how we as a community are integrated into that response. Everything I've seen to date in the report backs that in. One other thing I'd like to say, there's lots of things in there. There's lots of expectations with this report, and it does meet some of those expectations. Some of them can happen immediately, some of them will take time, and we just have to stay on the case with the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation to make sure. One of the recommendations, of course, is that there will be a reconstruction authority statewide. That's a good thing, because in this situation, we all looked north. We saw the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, which has had 11 years to operate, and it operated well. It was good to hear Professor O'Kane talk about the environment. That's important. We have to factor that in. And also we heard today buybacks, and we heard land swaps, and of course, Premier, you know that there's people who want relocatables, and both you and David Witherton have said that that will be in the mix as well. So everything will be in the mix. I'll leave it there because I could talk for an hour on this, but I realise you want to ask questions of others. Have I covered everything, members?
Thanks, Annabelle.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Thanks, Janelle. Questions?
You mentioned with the buyback, you mentioned just the homes have been destroyed. What about homes that are structurally
Yeah.
sound, but the owners want to move
Yeah.
because they're
Everything that is all encompassing. This will be a targeted approach in relation to a buyback or a land swap scheme. We have committed to doing that as part of our response. And it is the right thing to do, because we know events like this are going to happen again. And every time we have events like this, the government of the day ends up doing the same thing over and over again. And what happens? The government then comes in with taxpayer dollars and helps people get through it. That's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, and government will always stand side by side our communities. But we need to look at new ways of doing things. Buybacks and land swaps are an important part of that. Now, I know today that whilst we are saying that we're accepting that recommendation, I appreciate that that will provide some uncertainty for people who do not know if they will be affected by that scheme. But please be assured that I will be doing everything I can to have that scheme finalised as quickly as possible to provide confidence in the community in relation to that program.
Former treasurer and now someone with the ultimate responsibility for state's finances. Does it make you angry to think that $1.2 billion has been spent on the Resilience New South Wales since April 2021, given this report has highlighted such an acute need for massive cultural change, which is supposed to be delivered by that agency as an overarching authority?
Well, from what I've read in the report and the advice that I've received from Mick Fuller, and also the experience of people on the ground, we should have done things better. Mistakes were made, and a lot of those mistakes were structural mistakes that can be rectified and improved. And I think the recommendations that we have in this report do that, whether that's the merging of the back office of the SES and the RFS, whether that's standing up a permanent State Emergency Operations Centre under the guidance of a new Deputy Police Commissioner, or whether that's transforming Resilience New South Wales into a leaner recovery agency for the first 100 days post the event, I think makes a lot of sense. I also want to make this point about Resilience New South Wales. I have met so many good people from Resilience New South Wales during my time post this flood event. The government centres, the one-stop shop where people go following an event to get Commonwealth support, state support or local council support, Resilience New South Wales has been on the front line as part of that process. I have been on phone calls during the February flooding with people from Resilience New South Wales well into the early hours of the morning. So I want to make the point today that we have so many great frontline public servants who are part of all of these organisations who work tirelessly. In fact, I remember being in Lismore at just after the event, and I met somebody from Resilience New South Wales who left their home that was being flooded to be in that emergency centre looking after others. That is what I expect from the public service, and that is the dedication that our people have. And I'll just finish. And as we transition to Recovery New South Wales, many of those people, in fact, all those people who want to, we will ensure they have a role providing a similar service. Sorry.
Spoken to Shane Fitzsimmons and told him that the commissionership of Resilience New South Wales has been made redundant?
Well, obviously, during the preparation of the government response to the report and prior to it coming out, I met with Shane Fitzsimmons in relation to the direction of where the government was heading in relation to this. So he appreciated and understood that. I see that I'd expect that and want to continue to work with Shane as we transition into Recovery New South Wales.
Rung him and said your job's no longer on.
Well, I met with him, and I think it was the discussion that Shane and I had.
He's just released an all-staff email saying that he hasn't heard from him.
Well, I haven't spoken to him today. I met with Shane during the and DPC engaged with Shane as well as I during the preparation of the government response. We talked about the role that Shane would play in respect of a transition to a new agency as Resilience would be evolving into a new, leaner Recovery New South Wales. So
do you have a budget for the buyback scheme? And can you, excuse me for a moment, do you have a budget for the buyback scheme? And can you confirm that any land swap or buyback offer would be based on market values pre the flood?
Well, we will work through those details in a reasonable way. In terms of dollar figure, well, look, responding to this is going to cost billions of dollars, but it's the right thing to do. The buyback scheme will obviously be very costly. I have reached out, contacted the Prime Minister this morning in relation to funding that we will work through with the Commonwealth Government. That's a precedent that was set following the Grantham floods in Queensland, where the Commonwealth Government worked closely with the Queensland Government in relation to joint funding options, particularly in respect of buyback or land swap schemes. And so we would expect to take the same approach. Obviously, the devastation, particularly here in the Northern Rivers, is much greater, but I'll work very closely with the federal government to get a funding deal on the table. In terms of the criteria, I'll work through that, as I've said and committed to, as quickly as possible.
But I want to know if the key part of it is going to be, do you pay them what the house was worth before the flood or what it's worth now? Because that value is...
Well, clearly we do it as before, because that's the value of the home at the point in time prior to the devastating event occurring. But in terms of I don't want to give a running commentary in relation to the criteria because I haven't resolved that criteria yet. We've received the report very recently, and we've wanted to get out a response as quickly as possible. I understand and appreciate the points that Janelle Saffin, the local member, has made. She would have. I didn't want to release the report in isolation. I know that was the view of the member for Lismore. I disagreed with her, which we do from time to time, because I wanted to give certain direction about what the government response was going to be, whilst not having the full detail around it. So there's guidance to the local community of direction. I believe our government response provides for that. And now I will work through on some of those recommendations to finer detail. And as I said, in relation to land swaps and buyback schemes, I want to have that criteria finalised as quickly as possible. And as I said earlier, David Witherden will commence an EOI for land owners at the end of August, so we can determine where land may be available, so that when we do rebuild and do have those land swaps and buyback schemes in place, that we continue the charm and the character of our great local communities in the Northern Rivers.
Premier, how many questions Shane Fitzsimmons expected to be in his role, and what does his merger of the back office of the SES and RFS mean for Carleen York?
Well, no, Carleen is still the Commissioner of the SES. This is and I'll have Mick.
Will that stay? Does she still have your
Yes.
support, given that the report is quite damning of the SES, finding it failed to, meet its obligations under the various legislative instruments? So does she still have your support?
Yes, she does. Yes, she does. And I think Carleen is a great Commissioner of the State Emergency Services. She's a strong leader of that organisation. And I'm going to make this point again. What I don't want to be seen is running down the volunteer organisation of the SES.
Well, she paid
She is, and she coordinates and shows incredible leadership in relation to our frontline volunteer SES service. I want to finish and make the point that the SES will still continue in the format that it is on the front, in the volunteer-facing organisation led by Carleen York as the SES Commissioner. There is a lot of sense which Mick Fuller has taken you through in relation to the back office functions and combining them. That is not an affront on any organisation in the government. That is ensuring that we're able to gear up and make sure that our volunteers, wherever they are in the SES or the RFS, are given the support they need. Now, in relation to Shane, well, I mean, I'll obviously.
Isn't it fair if these very receptive leaders have some certainty over their jobs going into the coming months and the flood season?
And I've met, and as I said, I met with Shane when we were I met with Shane following the briefings that I'd received from Professor O'Kane and Mick Fuller, and had an understanding and an appreciation of where this transition would be going. So in those, no, before that, because I had briefings in relation to where the report was. So in those circumstances, it was appropriate for me to meet with Shane Fitzsimmons as part of that, to give an understanding of directionally where the government would be heading in respect of this report. I very much value Shane Fitzsimmons and the work that he's done for the New South Wales government. He's been an absolute hero to our state, particularly during the worst bushfire season in our history. Shane was there on the front line and did an amazing job in protecting our local community, also providing care and comfort and support during that devastating time for people across our state. And in addition to that, I've spoken to Shane about how I would like his continued involvement in relation to the transition from resilience to recovery.
Promoted very heavily by the government, Premier, in the same way Phil Coburn, his predecessor, was too, as a hero, a bureaucrat paid to do a very important job. What's his future now? He does have that elevated status. He was given a lot of media attention, which was promoted by the government, encouraged. So, does he have a job or not? I mean, he's a man of, he was an Australian father of the year just 2 years ago, so he's a national figure. Can you just give the community or the public a straight answer on whether he has a future in the lofty halls of emergency services management, for which he's been so distinguished?
Well, I will work through that. The discussions I've had, the discussion I've had with Shane in respect of this issue has been that as a result of the structural changes that the government is taking here, that Resilience New South Wales will transform into a leaner body. I don't make decisions based on personalities. No, it does not. This is an organisational change to ensure that the structures of government are in place to make sure we are in the best position to respond and provide care and support for the community, and ensure that natural disasters are dealt with appropriately. This is very important, because Shane Fitzsimmons has been a great stalwart for our state. He has served our community incredibly well, as I said, particularly during the bushfires. We have made a decision to transition to an operation. Every decision we are making is focused on one thing and one thing only. That's our people. And that's our people in terms of how we respond to a flood, to a bushfire, and on recovery. That is the focus. I don't make decisions based on people's personalities. I make decisions based on what is right and in the best interest of the people of the state, and that's what we've done.
Can I ask the Deputy Premier just quickly, just on the buybacks, like, a lot of these guys here are in this boat, right? They're expecting you guys to stand up today and give them some certainty, be it a matrix, be it some eligibility criteria. Can you understand why they're frustrated?
Oh, look, absolutely. And I've been up here on numerous occasions, and I think I was only here 2 weeks ago, and I said to the community then when I did a stand-up that we would release the report as quickly as possible. That's why we've actually worked through the report. There's a government response to the recommendations that have been put forward, but some of this work still needs to take place. And that's why we'll go away and we'll do it as quickly as possible, because we want to give the community certainty in this area. That's why with the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation, we're not waiting. That's why David Witherden is actually going out at the end of this month to look at expressions of interest where we can actually see land for new homes to be a part of it.
When will there be an answer?
Ballpark time frame?
Absolutely, and it will have be an answer. There will definitely be an answer before Christmas, and I can tell you right now that we're also working through structures. We're also working around future land development here in this area, and that's important because people are hurting. People put their lives on hold, and I think we all acknowledge that. The Premier and myself have been up here on numerous occasions. We've spoken to people that have been devastated. They've had their lives turned upside down. What we've done is ensure that this report has come back quicker than it was anticipated. Let's not forget, this report was not due for another 2 months. So it has come back in a more timely manner, and now the government can actually do the work that needs to sit behind it to give the community certainty.
Mick, can I ask you a question about the emergency response that I saw that you made some findings about? Yeah. We had that really distressing situation where people were trying to call 000 and trying to call the SES hotline, and their calls weren't getting through, and they were getting recorded messages telling them to call the other mob. Could you run me through what the findings were there and what the recommendations were to try to ensure that doesn't happen again? Because it was a really distressing part of the whole disaster.
So the State Rescue Board around 2 years ago signed off on a protocol whereby New South Wales Police VKG would play a key role in relation to flood rescue. Now, even in these type of events when there's multiple thousands of people calling in, obviously we need to do more work, but the SES could never have a system that could possibly take thousands of calls. You need an agency like New South Wales Police or potentially Fire and Rescue where there's enormous redundancy built into 000, but there's not just taking the call, it's then the coordination of the rescue. So at the moment, if there are multiple rescues from road crash or from vertical rescue, that's coordinated by police, and those jobs are farmed out to the agency that is closest to that event. I've suggested to the State Rescue Board that they need to emulate that for flood rescue. It doesn't take away the important role that SES will have in flood rescue, but clearly in these major events, having 200 people planned to do flood rescue is clearly not enough. And we also need to make sure that the person who is best trained, best equipped, that is closest to the person that is responding to that rescue in a coordinated way. So what I'm really talking about is taking their philosophy on how we do every other type of rescue and putting flood rescue into that, and that would in theory be coordinated through VKG police, where there is huge redundancy built in to take thousands of calls.
So why was it when people dialed 000, they actually got a recorded message saying, if this is about a flood emergency, please call the SES?
As my understanding is that when people if people ring 000 for a fire, it gets put through to New South Wales Fire and Rescue. If people ring 000 in relation to a flood, it gets put through to the SES. Now, the SES were clearly overwhelmed in relation to it, and we know, I heard evidence directly from unit leaders where they had turned off Beacon, which is their main system for calls of service, because they were overwhelmed. We heard evidence where up to 3,000 calls for service were lost in Lismore alone in terms of people requiring flood rescue, and as the Premier said, it's just not good enough for the community.
Can I ask why the police should leave Recovery New South Wales? And is that correct?
So what my suggestion was is that Resilience New South Wales was built with good intentions. It was well funded, it had lots of people in it, but it just didn't deliver. It's been there for now 2.5 years, so it's not a new agency. Unfortunately, we heard consistently from people on the ground, there was enormous confusion about what their role was. There was enormous criticism as well, and I will reiterate what the Premier said. There's lots and lots of good people there who we don't want to lose. But what we need is a much smaller, robust, flexible recovery